Yen Tan, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic. And yeah, my Monstera just got a new leaf, and so it's a day for celebration indeed. Yeah.
Oh,
Very
yes, mine is doing pretty well too. It's actually right behind my computer.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
So
love
you
it.
have an interactive workshop for us that we get to jump into, and I'll be here if you need anything. I'm hanging out in the background. I'll keep an eye on the chat as well.
Fantastic. And yeah, so happy to be here. We've been big fans of Power to Fly for forever and just super excited to be talking about a subject near and dear to my heart. And as an Asian American, also, I think it's something that a lot of our community can really use as well. So yeah, hopefully you'll learn something. Here's my little presentation. So as we discussed, this is about fighting burnout and supporting well-being for remote teams. And I got that excellent introduction earlier. So thank you so much. I wanted to start out really quickly with a quick little poll. If folks just want to share how they're feeling, green, yellow, red. Green is great, yellow, okay, red, terrible. You can throw it into the chat and we can just kind of see throughout the day how folks are checking in. Just know it does take quite a bit of vulnerability to share that you're feeling yellow and that yellows are completely okay, reds are completely okay. And we need to normalize feeling not okay at work because there's a global pandemic and it definitely happens every now and then. So just wanted to call that out. Hunter, thank you so much for sharing that you are feeling yellow. I'm feeling a little lime myself, and I think it's just, again, completely normal to not be okay. So please keep throwing that in the chat and stuff. We'll just kind of see as that goes, and I'll just move forward. We have a pretty ambitious little workshop here today where we'll be tackling the subject of burnout, well-being, intersectionality as well. So very open slate for you today. A little bit more about me. As you got that awesome kind of introduction earlier, I'm co-founder of Kona. We are a manager co-pilot kind of habit engine, but we also tackle a lot of subjects of well-being and team well-being at work, specifically for remote teams. I also am proud to say I'm somebody who has burned out before. Proud and not proud to say perhaps, because the irony is not lost that while working at a team well-being startup, I burned out. Yeah, I think it's a very tricky subject and something that sneaks up on people way before they're aware of it. And so I want to call out why that happens. And we'll be talking a lot about the causes of burnout and what you can do about it throughout today's workshop. Um, Also, just know that this is all rooted in a lot of our research. We've talked to over 1,000 remote managers since the beginning of 2020, trying to build Kona, and in doing so, really learning about the subject and the space, and particularly burnout throughout this crazy time that we've been living through. So again, really awesome kind of slate of things for you today. We'll be going through the intro that you just saw. We'll be talking about burnout. Then we'll be going into boundary settings and also as well as like stress cycles. And then finally talking a little bit about intersectionality. The Q&A itself is actually kind of slotted out throughout the subject. I know that there can be a lot of questions and I don't want to just talk at you. So it's a very interactive workshop. Please continue to submit your questions about burnout in the chat. I'll be pausing after every single section and essentially talking about those individual things. Super exciting stuff. So without further ado, I'm actually going to talk first about the stress cycle and your brain and just helping folks understand where stress comes from. I think if we can identify stress and its cause, we can really start to understand why burnout is so prevalent, especially here in the 21st century and virtual digital age. So let's talk about stress. First, it's important to know that our brains are wired to respond to fear. As a matter of fact, there's a center in your brain called the amygdala that is perfectly designed around this. That fear center allows you to react very quickly when threats arrive. And our ancestors really benefited from this when they saw tigers, bears, predators in the wild. When there was something hunting them, it was very helpful to have energy drawn away from the stomach, for muscles to tighten, for the brain to say, we need to run now, and for you to have that kind of fight or flight instinct. But nowadays, we don't really face as many tigers. As a matter of fact, our tigers are important, scary emails from a boss or coworker, an email that we might have forgotten, a task that we need to do urgently. That triggers the same kind of stress fight or flight response as a tiger nowadays. And as a result, it opens up a stress cycle. A stress cycle is pretty simple and straightforward. It's this kind of thing that creates this feeling of always being stressed over time. You essentially notice a stressor, the wild tigers of the office or virtual environment, and you have some sort of negative reaction to the stressor. If you can either leave in the chat or think about it yourself, what are the things that your body does when it's stressed? Well, for me, I know my hands get very clammy. I know my stomach starts to turn, or if I'm really anxious, I start to get stomach aches. I know that sometimes over longer periods of time, I get migraines. You'll notice all the things I'm describing are physical symptoms of a psychological kind of reaction like stress. We have that negative reaction. And as a result, our body realizes that there are more predators, quote unquote, in this environment that we're in. So it increases its sensitivity to these different stressors. So we're able to detect them when your stressors are a work environment. So that leads us to the next topic of burnout and the kind of overall understanding of burnout. I think it's very muddled. I think it's very common for people to throw out the word burnout to and fro and for it to get a little confusing. So let's get some definitions on the table and stuff as we're going through. Burnout 101. Burnout occurs when the demands of our day-to-day work or home experience chronically outstrips our capacity to meet those demands. So we just talked about stress cycles. Imagine what happens over a prolonged period of time as those stress cycles get opened, maybe 20 or 30 of them are opened per day for weeks or months at a time. We start to face something called burnout. And I think it's really helpful to kind of isolate exactly what burnout is. And so as we look at the World Health Organization and we see this as a workplace syndrome, we can see that burnout is officially defined by 3 different categories. The first, emotional exhaustion, that classic feeling that you have nothing left to give, that is very akin in how folks oftentimes recognize their own burnout. The kind of tricky next thing is perceived inefficacy, this feeling that you are not good enough or suddenly you suck at your job. That feeling is very common for folks that experience burnout. And the feeling of chronically underperforming or not being able to give as much is very, very common. The third thing, increased cynicism, is also very prevalent, but sometimes mistaken as depression-like symptoms. The idea that you suddenly don't have any hope in the kind of future of your work, that you suddenly feel very cynical, not optimistic at all about your future prospects in this role, that can obviously lead to burnout as well and kind of factor in with this larger kind of symptom. So I just want to take a quick pause to recognize each of these 3 factors and to open up a question to the audience. How often have you felt each of these different things? Do you feel like you're experiencing this now? Is this something that perhaps you experienced recently in the last 6 months? And was the presence of all bad one? I can tell you in the earlier stages and I had to check myself. Ironically, I was giving this presentation and also realizing I had stayed up kind of late the night prior and was feeling a lot more of this emotional exhaustion and perceived inefficacy. The faster we can name these things, the better we're able to kind of identify, isolate, and tackle these different problems. I also want to call out what causes burnout. So there are a lot of different factors that can cause you to experience burnout, such as indifferent managers, maybe frustrating teammates, the inability to use PTO. Even if you have unlimited PTO options, it can be very common that you're unable to feel or actually experience and take a proper vacation. Also, by the way, seeing the chat, and thank you to everybody that shared a yellow and stuff. I definitely know it can be really tricky. I appreciate you for pulling through for this lovely little presentation. I see you. And also, yeah, definitely have been there. Hopefully you get some tips today that can make your day a little bit shinier and greener. So other things that cause burnout, increased pressure at work, something that we're all feeling as the macroeconomic environment gets a little bit more difficult and we're asked to do more with less. If you've experienced recent layoffs or just kind of reorganizations, these can definitely increase the pressure that you feel. In addition, mental health stigma at work is something that we often obviously don't talk about because of stigma, but the inability to share that you're not doing okay, that you feel yellow or that you're struggling to your boss or teammates, that is very common and only makes burnout problems worse. Another thing, poor work-life boundaries. We'll tackle that in an entire section on what boundaries are and how to establish them. And also value misalignment. That tricky last one is all about whether or not what you're doing is actually filling your cup. And that leads to some very large soul-searching, bigger questions, etc. But being able to align what you're working on and what you're trying to get out of life can be a huge cure for burnout and its symptoms. So I just want to call out really quick also the physical things that I named earlier. We named all the kind of physical stressors that we might experience, the symptoms of experiencing stress. But as we experience burnout, a whole different type of set of symptoms appear. Chronic fatigue or insomnia, a loss of appetite, more frequent short-term illness, long-term health conditions, or just some of the things that your body does to sound the alarm bells and like show you that you have been experiencing burnout for a prolonged period of time. Unfortunately, you hear a lot of horror stories about this, that somebody didn't realize how burnt out they were until they were hospitalized, where they maybe had a seizure, unfortunately, an ulcer, some sort of extreme kind of body reaction. Our goal is to give you the education and also tools to prevent that from ever happening. But that does happen at times when folks push themselves well beyond their means and they experience the kind of illness and symptoms that happen. I think if you take nothing away, just know all the different types of stressors and the psychological things we face have direct consequence and effect on how our body reacts. It's all connected in there. It also affects everyone. Some of the stats that we were able to pull is that 63% of managers experienced burnout in the pandemic, 52% of exiting employees said their manager could have done something, and 62% of teams said that manager discussions on mental health would have helped. So the problem we're seeing here just through the statistics is that more and more managers are burning out. We're asking these burnt out managers to do the hard emotional labor of supporting teams. And those teams are essentially saying that they're not getting enough discussions on mental health to support their health care journey and their well-being journey. So I just wanted to leave everybody with this little check-in exercise. We'll do it for a few minutes, but essentially check in with yourself. In the last 6 months, when have you experienced the following? When have you felt run down and drained of emotional and physical energy? When have you felt like you've been underachieving or unable to accomplish all the work that you've been assigned? How often have you felt misunderstood or underappreciated by coworkers, or this persistent negative or hopeless thoughts about your job? If you're really strongly identifying with any of the things on this list, you could be on the earlier stages or later stages of burnout. It's important to call out that this is completely normal, especially in a highly demanding workplace, and that there are things we can do to address this. But I think the first important thing to do is name it. So I'll let you sit with this for a second, and meanwhile, I'll tackle an audience question. This question asks, what are some of the common misconceptions about remote work, and how can these be addressed to create a more supportive and effective virtual work environment? This question itself deserves an entire other PowerPoint probably, but I can say the first thing is that remote workers are completely isolated, that they completely live on their own satellites and islands, and that they have no interest perhaps or have very little opportunity to socialize and interact with other teammates. And as a result, most likely that they burn out by themselves by just kind of overworking in this silo. I would argue that that's a very common misconception of remote work in general, and that oftentimes remote work can be extremely social. As a founder of a team that is 13 strong and working across the world from Los Angeles to Vienna, I can firmly say that we have a lot of social interaction. It really just has to do with being very intentional about how we tackle these things, navigating time zones, and leaning into async practices that can actually lead us to be social in an async environment. So that's just one question. Thank you. And please keep submitting questions as we're going. And yeah, I'll keep on, I'm getting more questions, so please keep throwing them in and I'll answer them after each of these little sections. But again, take this self-check-in exercise. I'll send the PowerPoint slides at the very end so everybody has it as a resource, and keep reflecting and checking in with yourself on these questions as we go along, multiple times per year, honestly. If you can do it every few months, you'll be a lot better at identifying and catching burnout earlier and taking the necessary steps to fix it. Great. So let's talk about breaking burnout and what it requires in order to stop burnout in its tracks. Now that we understand what burnout is, what can you do about it? It's probably one of the most common questions that I get because burnout is so common and so many folks face this in their day-to-day lives. So what I talked about earlier was that stress cycle. And on an average day, you're probably opening up several stress cycle loops just by navigating the work environment. Maybe somebody catches you off guard with a task that they need done by end of day. Maybe somebody is asking you to answer this important email or context switch rapidly or give a presentation that you weren't prepared for. All these things, the things that ignite that kind of fight or flight little fear amygdala in your brain, are opening up stress cycles over time that, unfortunately, unless you are consciously aware of them, never really get closed. So as you can imagine, scaled up from a month's view, several months view, quarters view, we're having hundreds of these stress cycles open that we're not really doing anything about. If we keep them open, we're further along the kind of burnout risk. And so let's talk about shutting them down. The way that you break a stress cycle is very simple. You redirect it. So you might notice a stressor, you have a reaction, but hopefully you add in this positive coping strategy that essentially turns the energy away from increasing sensitivity to stressors and essentially breaks that cycle. It's a pretty simple concept and oftentimes, though, harder to implement. And so some things that can help break stress cycles are extended PTO. We're talking 4+ days if you can swing it to completely shut off work and reset. Prioritizing sleep and recovery, finding community everywhere that you go, practicing meditation, gratitude, reassessing your goals and priorities, sweating it out. Exercising is a great way. I personally do Krav Maga or some sort of martial art that is very, very helpful for sweating and kind of breaking stress in its tracks, and reinforcing your boundaries, which I'll talk about more later in this section. Each of these things can be fantastic stress cycle breakers and something that you can do over time and create habits around. However, just note that like one great bubble bath is not going to completely solve your burnout issue. I think that's the biggest problem I have with self-care, like folks constantly talking about self-care and equating it to rosé and bubble baths. It's just not enough to create and stop this like regular stress cycle production. I say that's 5 times fast. So let's talk about how we can actually cure burnout. We know what breaks stress cycles. Now we need to figure out how to turn them into processes. So we need something called boundaries. If you've been to therapy, you've probably heard this word thrown out a ton. Boundaries are the limits and rules on what is acceptable and healthy for an individual. It can be very scary. Sometimes we mistake boundaries for being these strong lines in the sand that we always need to abide by, and that anybody who crosses that line is in the wrong. It's not so black and white. It's definitely something that can kind of create a little perimeter around yourself to help you protect what you need in order to create that work-life balance. So first off, calling out signs of good and bad boundaries. Great or bad boundaries essentially is normalizing consistent overtime, constantly working late, saying yes to everything, worrying while you're off, checking Slack or your messaging platform constantly, maybe your email constantly. These are all signs that perhaps work is bleeding way more into life than necessary. A good boundary is clocking out of work, having a vibrant life outside of it, a realistic workload, and having rest that's truly restful. If you're taking PTO and you don't feel like you need PTO from your PTO, I think you're on the right track. And so let's do a little exercise here. I'm going to give folks a few minutes to essentially create their well-being cheat sheet. This is your cheat sheet when it comes to establishing boundaries and understanding your needs. It includes writing down how many hours of sleep you can get and how you can get that sleep, how many days of exercise you need per day, and how you can actually get moving. Food, great meals, friends that you can reach out to, how long you need to disconnect from your phone or from work or from other people, and also family time and what quality family time means to you. I want everybody to take a few minutes. I realize I put down 5, but we might not have that long, so I'll give you 3 minutes. Fill it out. Again, you'll get these slides at the end, so you can, of course, reference this slide and fill it out properly, but really take the time to fill this out if you can. It's a great means for setting up the next step, which is establishing boundaries. So I will pause for a little bit and let folks do this. I also want to call out, I got a fantastic question about racial and ethnic differences when it comes to burnout. I literally have a whole slide and section dedicated to that, so we will be tackling that in just a second. All right, I know it's not a ton of time. You have about 1 more minute. So go ahead and finish up writing down, just finish up whatever section you're on. And if you want, feel free to share it into the chat. I'd love to see how all of y'all need to basically take care of yourselves. I can give an example for myself. I actually realized throughout the pandemic, ironically, how important it is for me to disconnect. I think it was forced alone time. And after a while, I actually realized that was quite good for me as an introvert. And so for me, I realized I need to disconnect at least after 10 p.m. I used to take these friend calls late at night, and I always felt super amped up and then couldn't go to bed. It's really important for me to turn off my phone, keep some distance from it, and really create that separation in order for me to sleep and actively take care of myself. So that's just one of the many sections we can fill out here. So yeah, share it in the chat. Fantastic. And I'm already getting a view of some awesome things being shared, such as like soba noodles, awesome miso soup, like just some really great. I'm already getting hungry just thinking about it and stuff. Good thing it's almost lunchtime. So yeah, let's move on to how you use this well-being cheat sheet in the wild to establish boundaries. So let's just say one of your options was maybe not the salmon, but to get soba noodles or to cook for yourself every single lunch period. A lot of folks, unfortunately, skip lunch, especially if you're working in a remote environment and you have a lot of back-to-back meetings. Setting the boundary for your lunch period means having to say no to a meeting, asking for things to be moved, or really creating this one firm block that doesn't get disrupted when it comes to your meal times. It can be really important to not be sitting at your computer to actually have a meal at a table or have the time to cook. And so understand how long that takes and also what you'll need to carve around in order to make that happen. This is what I mean by going from a self-care bubble bath to actually a process. We need to establish boundaries that regularly protect our self-care and ensure that we can consistently break those stress cycles over time. I'll give another example of having exercise. It's very similar to the food aspect and example. You need time to exercise, and especially if you're trying to still hit those New Year resolutions, actually running a few miles per day can take quite a bit of time. Scheduling time in your afternoon, blocking and time blocking your calendar out so you have a section for calls and a section for deep work perhaps, and a section for recreation. That can be really, really important for protecting that really important stress cycle breaker, such as breaking out a sweat and being able to get out there and run. So these are just some examples, very gentle examples of boundaries. There are harder conversations that need to be had, sometimes difficult conversations as you negotiate these boundaries, but boundaries are some of the most important ways that you can actually go forward and take care of yourself over time. So boundaries, important, not scary. Awesome. The last thing I want to talk about is very particularly relevant to the AAPI community and AAPI month. I got this awesome question from Yuklo of how have you found racial or ethnic differences in the level of burnout that one experiences? Absolutely. And that's what we try to tackle in this section. I also want to tackle allyship. And so if you don't identify as a person of color or as a queer person, that's okay. You can also be an ally. And allyship is defined by the actions, behaviors, and practices that leaders can take to support, amplify, and advocate with others. So let's talk about well-being for marginalized communities. First off, it's AAPI month. As a sixth-generation Chinese American who has had a long kind of root in history in San Francisco Bay Area, it's really like I very much identify as an Asian American, and this month makes me very, very happy. I think it's a very misunderstood community, and that we can shine a lot more light and kind of break down stereotypes like the model minority myth by talking and recognizing Asian American efforts. I also want to call out that overall, Asian Americans and other BIPOC people face added stressors that make burnout and mental health issues much more common. This doesn't even tackle generational trauma or the different types of stressors that affect there, but just know that that is also factored in here. Things like cultural stigma against therapy is very common among Asian Americans and quite well documented. That definitely adds extra pressure and also strain on mental health. A lack of BIPOC therapy options is something I've definitely individually experienced, and I'm sure a lot of my other folks have experienced as well. There are simply not a lot of therapists that understand our personalized context, and that can sometimes lead us away or discourage us from seeking professional options. Things like imposter syndrome at work, particularly, can be very, very relevant and add added stressors and burnout, and this feeling that we're constantly trying to prove ourselves. Exposure to racism. Stop Asian Hate was fantastic, but unfortunately it was a result of anti-Asian sentiment and violence through the COVID-19 pandemic. And so constant exposure to racism definitely occurs both through microaggressions and larger acts and legislation, and something that we definitely need to call out. And other things like cultural pressures like filial piety and unique family caregiving situations and expectations can only add to these level of stressors that we might not talk about at work, but that definitely affect our day-to-day work experience. So these are just some of the things. BIPOC people and queer individuals definitely experience a lot more stress and strain, and it definitely shows up in the frequency of burnout in these communities. There's a lot of things that you can do to be an ally for AAPI month and also to take care of other Asian Americans in your life. The first thing I would love to call out is just don't treat us as a monolith. Educate yourself about the very diverse history of AAPI individuals. From one stat, I saw that there were over 2,000 languages spoken in just the APAC region. So be very aware of blanket statements, the kind of all Asians do this, or oh, are you all Chinese? Obviously, with hints of racism and also just a monolith treatment definitely does not support the kind of community. Also saying, of course, no to stereotypes and understanding kind of the nuance of the mild minority myth and other myths that make unfair pressures at work. Listening, being open to feedback is fantastic. And also understanding that we're all here to get it right, not be right, is a very careful and awesome distinction that can really help you be open and a much stronger ally. And finally, of course, donate to really awesome causes. I heard fantastic causes mentioned in just the previous speaker series, but things like the Stop Asian Hate movement are still more important than ever, as those kind of hate crimes are still prevalent and on the rise. Get involved, donate, learn how to report racism, and be a better bystander. These are just some of the trainings we can do in order to be better allies and take some of the pressure off of the AAPI community. I have a bunch of resources saved at the very end. I'd love to tackle one or two more questions if we have the time, but thank you so, so much for chatting with me. Of course, we have Kona, the kind of manager, assistant, and also well-being support platform. If you want to check it out, it's heykona.com. And we also have a lot of mental health resource for you, that burnout report that I mentioned earlier. And of course, you can always reach out to yours truly. Just send me an email with any of the questions. We can definitely chat about those. So yeah, thank you. And I'm here to tackle any additional questions if we have time. But yeah.
Oh my gosh, Yen, that was so powerful. Thank you so much for that. Everything aces across the four aces. Like you are such a delight to listen to. You're so at ease. You have so much wisdom. Thank you for sharing all of that. Also, one of the slickest slide decks I've seen in a long time. So props to you. Very nice.
Thank you. Shout out to Canva. I don't have a design bone in my body, so Canva enables me to. Little
Oh,
advertisement.
well, it's all about what you do with it, right? You still have a sense of what looks good, clearly. We're not all here to we're all here to get it right, not be right. Hello, come on. That's incredibly so, yes, yes, yes. So on point. And thank you so much for talking about boundaries and therapy as a resource. My first therapist, I'm a big advocate and beneficiary of therapy, said to me, the creation of boundaries is a loving act,
Yeah.
which is hard to wrap my head around when boundaries were new.
Yeah, exactly. And especially the people pleaser, establishing boundaries felt like I was saying no to all the people I loved, but really I was teaching them how to take care of me. And that's really important.
Oh, completely. I also identify as a people pleaser in recovery.
Yes.
Recovering people pleaser. Well, Yen, thank you so much for making the time today. We're out of time. And I hope everyone does follow up with you. Thank you for dropping in your info. And I hope we have you back because this is just so incredible. Thank you so
Amazing.
much.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have to hop, but it was lovely chatting with all of you. Again, my email is yen@heykona.com. If you have any questions, please send it right my way. So
Okay,
awesome.
great. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.